Hello and welcome back. So next we turn to another international relations theory, and this international relations theory has a title you've probably heard of before. Of course, it's liberalism. So it's a new theory, but it's very much tied to the classic liberalism that we've met before. And once again, like with the case of realism versus neo-realism, liberalism or neoliberalism or structural liberal, there's all sorts of different variants of this theory. Once again, this is a super broad theory that has spawned lots of smaller theories, but we're just going to use the term liberalism once again. So we'll have to delineate sort of between classic liberalism and international relations liberalism, but they share a common thread. And so the classic liberal thinkers, people like John Locke, said, wow, we live in a world that is anarchic. Yes, it's dangerous and it's scary, but the state should step in and guarantee individuals their own individual rights, and the state should step in only to the extent that it absolutely has to guarantee those rights. Otherwise, it should sort of stay away. So that's the idea of classic liberalism. International relations liberalism shares a lot of this, and it sort of shares the perspective that yes, people can do bad things, people can go to violent ends, especially in a state of anarchy, but they're going to be like the framers of the US Constitution, those classic liberal thinkers who are thinking, well, we don't expect people to be enlightened necessarily, and so we're going to build systems of checks and balances, right? The idea that the framers of the US Constitution had was that the way that you designed these institutions was going to be enormously important for understanding how successful the state would be at preserving individual rights and liberties. And likewise, international relations liberal theorists are going to say, yes, there's anarchy in the world, but we can mitigate it. We can sort of look at other variables. It's not just about hard power. Their idea is that you can build different institutions or rules or practices or norms that can really affect the way that states act, and therefore work against that anarchy leading to violence problem. And so here is a picture of U.S. President Wilson, who was president in the late and aftermath of World War I. And he had the idea of a League of Nations, that would be able to prevent any war like that from ever happening again. Now, of course, quite famously, the U.S. President, Woodrow Wilson, was unable to get the U.S. Senate to ratify this. So the United States, probably the most important state in this idea of a League of Nations, didn't actually really have much to do with the League of Nations. And of course, it eventually failed, as did its mission of world peace, because World War II followed behind that. And of course, you can see this comic that he was sort of blowing bubbles out of idealism. And that's a common criticism against liberalism coming from realism. But the basic idea that he had is one of the central elements of liberal international relations theory. And one of those central elements is that you can build institutions that are going to, in part at least, overcome the problem of anarchy. So yes, there's no Leviathan, there's no world state. However, we do have the United Nations. Now, of course, the United Nations came to be after World War II, and it was basically Woodrow Wilson's original idea of the League of Nations, but realized much more fully after the even more catastrophic experience of World War II. And the idea here was the United Nations could enshrine certain things, like that different states are sovereign and have their own sovereignty over their own territory, but also that states, cannot but also work to create real laws at the international level. For example, here is the emblem of the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, and that was established shortly after the UN was established after World War II. And the idea here was, there are certain war crimes that you can't do. All's not fair in love and war. war, that if you commit violent crimes against vulnerable people, if you use biological or chemical agents in warfare, that makes you a war criminal. This is, built upon the Geneva Convention. And this is a basic idea of international relations liberalism. You can overcome anarchy by building the right institutions and the right laws. The European Union, here's the EU flag, was sort of another international relations liberal idea, and that is that we can build political union among these various states like the UK and France and Germany that have fought so much over the centuries before World War II, and of course culminating in the devastation of World War II. The idea was, look, we can build an institution that will overcome that and make fighting between France and Germany unthinkable, which, you could argue the UN, sorry, not the UN, the EU has done quite a good job at. A related idea is that if you can get different economies to be so integrated and so dependent upon one another, you can also avoid violence. Because if France and Germany rely upon one another for their economies, then they're not going to fight one another. They're not going to fight because it would be devastating for them to attack somebody who they rely upon to sell their goods or to get goods. And so another idea of liberalism is the idea of economic interdependence, or that different groups are dependent upon one another. And so what you see in this picture is a map of international shipping lanes. And you can see that all of these different countries are, just by shipping, but of course by all sorts of other ties, are really, really linked together. And so liberal theorists think that the more that we can integrate the world economically, the more likely we're overcoming anarchy to create a more peaceful world. And so neoliberal economics often is seen as basically meaning low barriers to trade. We're not going to have tariffs. We're not going to restrict the movement of goods, services, and people. And we're going to have as open as we can in terms of trade, because that will increase. Well, first of all, neoliberal economists also really believe that's the way to create the most actual prosperity in the world. But it's also, for international relations theorists that believe in liberalism, they also really strongly feel that integrating the world economically is going to create greater peace. Again, that's the idea that we are in the United States will not take an aggressive stance against China or vice versa, because we are so economically integrated, because what's good for the Chinese economy is good for the American economy and vice versa. And so that creates strong incentives for these states to play nicely with one another, because they don't want to wreak economic devastation upon their own societies in pursuing their international goals. So far we've seen that liberal theorists believe that you can build institutions like the United Nations, like the International Criminal Court, like the European Union, the World Bank, for example, in order to work to mitigate the problem that anarchy can lead to violence. They also believe that economic interdependence can help mitigate the possibility of violence coming from the anarchic world system. A final major strand of thought within the broad theory of international relations liberalism is called the democratic peace theory. And here they're arguing that the regime type of two states that may be in conflict is going to be very important for understanding whether that conflict escalates to actual violence and warfare. So again, they say that regime type is a key independent variable that explains the dependent variable of when two states will fight. Well, it says it right there in the title, Democratic Peace Theory, the central insight of democratic peace theory is that democracies don't fight one another. Now, it's very important to note that they're not saying that democracies don't go to war. In fact, the empirical evidence of that is that democracies go to war just as frequently as autocracies do. So it's not the case that democracies are more peaceful than authoritarian regimes, and that's on the quiz. So write that down. What democratic peace theory is saying is that democracies are unlikely to go to war with one another. So they're not saying that a democracy like the United States abstains from any warfare. They're saying that democracies like the United States abstain from warfare against other democracies like Canada or France or Germany. And empirically, there's robust support for this. It does seem to be the case that democracies are very unlikely to go to war with other democracies. You can find some counter examples, but they're pretty small fringe events, like the Falklands War between Argentina and the UK, which was a very low stakes sort of little ordeal. So there's debate on this, but there's also debate on sort of what the causal mechanisms would be. Um, the most popular idea is that the people of a democracy will punish their leadership. They'll vote them out of office if they feel like the war is not justified. And when you have popularly controlled leaders on both sides, the people are sort of able to see, well, those people, we have more in common with the other people in another state perhaps than we do with our leaders. And so that's one proposed causal mechanism, but this is actually kind of a hotly debated thing. This is another time when we see that there's a strong correlation, but we can't necessarily infer causation. Maybe there's something else going on causing both democracy and the relative peace between democracies. So to conclude our little discussion of liberalism with some more stunning artwork, you get to see this before it goes up in the art museums, right? Here are our states, and liberalism is saying, look, the more that we can integrate the economies of these states, the more likely we are going to have peace. Likewise, we can build international institutions. The United Nations, perhaps the biggest and most well-known, but there are tons and tons of different international institutions, and different states will, work through these institutions instead of just going to war. And so, in conclusion, liberalism adds more variables. For realists, they just need to see, the hard power and the balance of power, and that's going to explain all sorts of issues. So if you're a realist trying to think through what should we do about North Korea, you don't really care about culture or international institutions. You really care about the balance of power. What hard power does North Korea have? What hard power does Japan have? China, right? Who's allied with who? And that's going to help you predict everything. Liberals in the international relations usage of that term, liberal, they're going to add more variables. They acknowledge, yes, realists, you're correct. There's anarchy on the international system, and that can lead to violence. But we can mitigate that likelihood. We can mitigate that violence, decrease the likelihood that there will be war through institutions, economic interdependence, and spreading democracy. And indeed, that idea that democracy is going to lead to more peace has been a really key element of U.S. foreign policy in working to promote democracy worldwide. All right. Once again, we've covered a lot. Get in touch with any questions, comments, or concerns. Have a great day.